It doesn't.
Right. So that's what I want to talk about, because first of all, people that are not so familiar with drug addiction or like the terminology, right, that we all are. But talk about the concept of it being a disease and the fact that there is a way to identify genetic predispositions to addiction, as opposed to someone thinking, well, I know my cousin's addiction started because he lost his child and that threw him over the edge. And it was just something that happened that made him decide to numb his life. Talk about the difference.
Well, there's 4 major contributors, right? You have to have the basis for it. And what does this mean? This means you're willing to go all the way. That's all it really means. You're willing to be me or Anthony Kiedis or Jason Davis. You're willing, if you have this genetic basis and the other 3 ingredients come in place, you are willing to go all the way. That's what people can't understand about addicts. Why don't they stop? They lost their family. They lost their job. Why don't they stop? They can't stop. It's the people it's a small part of the percentage of the population, 3 to 10%, depending on who you believe. Once they get to that stage, that late stage, they can't stop. And so the 4 ingredients are genetic predisposition, childhood trauma, which if you're American, we all have it. The 3rd is exposure, meaning take drugs. So we're America, we all take drugs. So the 2nd and 3rd, every American probably experiences. The 4th is the most important one. And you'll see this in Seth Binzer and Jeff Conaway and myself and everyone else who's become labeled an addict, is the use of drugs in the face of adverse consequences and repeatedly doing that. And these are now that has narrowed it down to a precious few, right? So we all have people in our lives that just wouldn't stop. Your dad just wouldn't stop, maybe. He would promise. Here's the thing about addicts. When they're promising to stop, you can give them a lie detector test, they believe it, but they just can't.
Right.
And so outside of a spiritual awakening, outside of a meeting of somebody who you trust, all these.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. When you get to that point, what is it? Because they all talk about hitting a rock bottom, and that sometimes changes your mind. But is it only that? I mean, is there a certain type of treatment you really have to get, like ketamine? And we're going to get into what happened with Matthew Perry. But what will it take when someone is that far gone?
My belief, this is just my belief, is you have to meet the person. So there's a theory in Buddhism that when the student is ready, the teacher will appear, right? I believe we have to meet. That's why AA is so good. That's why rehabs are so good. You have to keep going out there to find the messenger that can convey the message to you, right? I found that in a 75-year-old woman from Venice, California. She was this old hippie woman. Everyone had tried to talk to me, rock stars and all these people and the greatest therapists in LA. And I'd be like, I don't want to talk to these people. And I saw this woman. I remember so clearly. It was Saturday afternoon, like at 4:00 at a little AA meeting on Vine Street and Santa Monica Boulevard. And I walked in. It was just a handful of people that I knew. It was a private AA meeting, weirdly, in LA. And this woman, from the moment I saw her, I was like, what the hell is with that lady? And I heard her laugh. I heard her laugh, and she just was alive, and she was just free of whatever it is that I wasn't free of. Her name was Gloria Scott, and she was a drug counselor, and she helped me and gave me insight about myself, and she stuck with me for from that point to when I got sober, is about 4 years. And she always had she always knew what to do, either hug me or tell me I was an asshole. She always had the magical thing. Like, she knew when I was too down to call me an asshole, and she'd say, come here, I love you so much. And then other times when I was arrogant, she would say, kind of fucking father are you? You know what I mean? She just would never stop. And so I've modeled after her. She passed away in 2005, but I've modeled after her. And I think there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people like her. And every addict's got to find that person. I've luckily been that person for quite a few addicts, and it feels
I was going to say, you are that person for many people, but Actually, can you tell our listeners a little bit about your story, about how
Okay, yeah,
drugs play
it's pretty.
such a role for you?
Yeah, you don't want to watch a video. So I was
Mhm.
born and raised like a spoiled child, kind of like in upper middle class or whatever. We didn't have classes back when I was a kid in the 60s. We were just pretty well to do. My dad had an airplane, and it's just like, and we went back and forth between Palm Springs and LA, and my dad had a supermarket chain called Thrifty Mart. And so I was the original spoiled child. I have three older sisters, and then along came me, and my dad always wanted a son. And so, I was raised to be a petulant rock star. Like, you know what I mean? It's just like it fit perfect. When the job came up to be a singer in a band, I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then I could just continue acting in this kind of selfish, but I always had this caring character, this caring soul in me, but I was spoiled, and then I became a musician. And so nobody could talk to me. Nobody could steer me right, and I kind of was my own worst enemy. And I made a bunch of records. I came up in the 80s with the Chili Peppers and Jane's Addiction in LA, but I was profoundly addicted to alcohol at probably, I don't know, 19. I mean, I was a morning drinker in college, and I didn't see anything wrong with it. Right.
But, like, were you able to function even though
Yeah,
you were
yeah,
drinking all the time?
astonishingly so. There's a famous producer named Tony Berg. His daughter now is a very successful musician. I was doing demos over at his house, and apparently, I was just drinking beer and recording with this engineer and Tony, and I was just drinking and doing a little coke and smoking a little heroin. I was there all day, and then the next day, his daughter and he cleaned up the studio, and they counted 30 Budweiser cans that I had
Oh my
drank
god.
in one day. And Tony was like, didn't even seem like he was drunk. Like, how can there be so many beer cans? But you build up a tolerance, and I'd been drinking from a pretty early age. And then when I got introduced to stimulants, that kind of rights you. And then heroin was the final frontier back then. Now it's the drug of the exposure drug nowadays with the prescription opioids. But we were always kind of scared of heroin in my gang. And then finally, once we did it, probably in 83 or 84, it took over our lives. And I always say, why was I able to make 5 albums and tour all over the world for 6 or 7 years? Because heroin came way later in my life.
Hmm.
I know that sounds ridiculous, but you can drink and do coke and kind of get through a day.
Right.
Once heroin comes into your life, you ain't doing nothing. You ain't going nowhere.